Recently here in Austin, the city council moved to put AI-powered surveillance cameras in all of our public parks. Previously, the city of Austin had worked with a company called Flock, which sells these cameras that they call license plate readers, or LPRs. The ACLU has warned that using Flock can create a massive record of everyone's activities. Essentially, wherever you go in a city, Flock will know about it. Flock works with cities, with corporations, and even homeowners associations to provide this surveillance technology. And in the process, they have developed a massive surveillance network. Thankfully, cities around the country have started to end their contracts with Flock. Sometimes this is because Flock works with organizations like ICE. Other times it's just been because of public outrage. More and more people are saying that this is too far and that they want their privacy back. For years, though, our privacy rights have been under attack. Back in 2010, Mark Zuckerberg said that the age of privacy was over, though one of Mark Zuckerberg's houses is a massive private compound, which he just added 1,000 acres to, which sounds pretty private to me. Today, I want to break this problem down into some parts. We'll talk about the government and corporations, but also ourselves, because our privacy isn't just being stolen, we willingly gave it away. But to start, we should talk about why privacy matters in the first place. I film most of my videos here in my office. I don't like to film in public. Part of that is just because I feel awkward when I go outside with a camera, and I always feel like everybody's watching me, which I know is a little bit strange because I put videos out on the internet where hundreds of thousands or sometimes even millions of people watch me, but it feels a little bit different when I'm doing it in person. So I mostly film here. But there's another reason that I don't like to film in public, and that's because I don't want people to think that I'm filming them. In fact, I feel embarrassed by the idea that I would be filming somebody without their consent. This doesn't stop other people though. If you walk down busy streets in Austin, then you will regularly see people filming interview content or even prank content for things like TikTok or YouTube Shorts or Instagram. It's all over the place. I remember once seeing a business owner just start screaming at a TikToker who was like holding up provocative signs outside of his business. And for a moment, I thought I should take a photo of that or I should record this. But then I thought I would be just as bad as the TikToker in the first place. So I didn't do it. And I can't show you it here on screen. Now, these people can legally do this, though, because in the United States, we say that you do not have a reasonable expectation of privacy when you go outside. In other words, it would be unreasonable of you to expect that someone wouldn't be filming you. And so we don't require anyone's consent in order to be recorded. And so all that you can do when this happens is just complain about it. But here's something I've noticed about myself. When I am on camera, I always behave a little bit differently. I am always in some ways performing for the camera or performing for the imagined audience. And I think that most people do that too. When they're being filmed, or even when they think they might be filmed, they start to behave differently. And if you think that you're under surveillance, or even that you just might be under surveillance, you also will start policing your own behavior. You might have heard in these sorts of discussions the idea of the panopticon. This was something that was cooked up by the philosopher Jeremy Bentham as part of a system of prison reform. And the idea was that at all times, prisoners, and most of these people would be debtors, and this would include their children, would always be working in order to pay off their debts. But it would be incredibly impractical for them to be surveilled constantly. It would require way too many guards in order to make sure that someone was always working. So Bentham's idea was to construct this prison where at all times it would be possible for you to be watched. It didn't really matter if you were being watched at the time, there was always just that threat of surveillance. And so the thought was people would just start working more and behaving properly here in quotes, because they might be watched. And I think roughly that's what's happening to us today when we talk about the erosion of privacy rights. As we lose our privacy, we start to live more and more of our lives in public. The philosopher Hannah Arendt writes about this briefly in her book, The Human Condition. And she says that a life that's lived in public, in the presence of others, becomes shallow. And she goes on to say that we need private places, like our homes, in order to live in darkness, which sounds worse than it really is. When Arendt talks about someone living in darkness, she actually means it as a positive. When writers of dystopian literature, like in science fiction, want to show how inhumane a regime has become, one of the first things they do is show how that regime always has the population under surveillance, including in their own homes. So in 1984, obviously, we have the idea that Big Brother is watching you, those giant eyes. But we also have the telescreens. These are televisions, but they're also cameras that are in everybody's home. One really important scene in 1984 shows a party member, a high-ranking party member, turning off the telescreen, showing that he's not under surveillance. It's a sign of his power that he is able to have privacy. 1984 was heavily inspired by an earlier science fiction novel called We by Yevgeny Zamyatin. In my mind, I think it is the better of the two novels. In that novel, people live in houses that are made out of transparent material, and that means they live all of their lives in their homes where everybody can see. As I was thinking about examples, I realized that there's an exception to this that's worth talking about too. That's in The Handmaid's Tale. I don't think there's any reference to cameras inside of houses in The Handmaid's Tale, but it's important to remember that the houses that we see are run by men who occupy positions of power, so maybe they get to have their privacy. Of course, we put cameras in our homes now, often by choice. We carry around devices that track our movements and allow us to record anybody, with just the click of one or two buttons. And when we walk around in public, we know that we're being watched, not just by other people who are just looking at us with their eyes, but by cameras, whether those are cameras that people are holding or cameras that are installed in basically every building. Now, whenever you talk about privacy, someone will inevitably ask, what do you have to hide? The implication is that if you value privacy, then you must be trying to obscure some undesirable fact about yourself. That's a very strange way to put that. I think the better way to say it is that you must just be trying to keep a secret. And we often assume that if someone is keeping a secret, then they must be up to something. This is one of the themes that's explored in Lowry Presley's book, The Right to Oblivion. Presley is a professor at Stanford, and he has written, I think, one of the best explorations of the right and value of privacy that I've ever found. Arguments about privacy are often misleading, Presley says, because we conflate privacy and secrets. Secrets feel bad. People think that you're up to something when you're keeping a secret. They think it's some dark fact about you that you don't want anybody to know. And if all you're doing is keeping these sorts of secrets, then people start to think that you don't really have a right to privacy. And in fact, I have a right to go and find out that secret about you. But Presley is similar to Arendt here, where he says that privacy allows people to live interesting lives and meaningful lives, in fact. And it produces what he calls human depth. It allows for people to build trust with each other. It also allows people to explore ideas and interests without worrying about those prying eyes. It allows them to flourish. Privacy gives you a sphere of your life where you don't have to worry about other people. And I think that is the main reason why privacy is so valuable. But we live in a world that hates privacy. And this is especially true of the corporations we do business with. Almost every corporation that you interact with is trying to collect your private information. They're not after just things that they need to make a sale, like your credit card information. I don't think it's much of an exaggeration to say that these corporations would like to know everything about you. A major reason for that is that the more they know about you, the easier it is for them to sell you things. And that's largely because they can use that private information to serve you ads. Even right now on YouTube, the ads that you'll be served on any video you watch are only partly determined by the content that you're watching at the time. Sometimes I have people who get mad at me because they get an ad that they really don't like that pops up when they're watching my videos. Almost always when I see the complaints, it's a complaint about a political candidate. But I'm sure that there are other ads that you've seen that have made you angry. And trust me, I understand why people find advertising annoying. But what's funny about those complaints is that the topic of my video, and in fact, almost any information about my channel, is largely irrelevant to the ads that you see. Instead, Google will send you ads based on your age, your race, your gender, your location, what religion they think you are, what they think your interests are, and crucially, how much disposable income they think you have. In order to do that effectively, they need to know a lot about you, which is why Google has invested hundreds of millions, perhaps even billions of dollars into its ability to scrape data and to categorize it about its users, all in service of their ad business. Google is not alone here. In fact, I want to tell you about an example that I found about very recently. And this affects something that almost everybody owns, which is a television. So on December 15th, the Texas Attorney General announced that he would be suing 5 major television companies. That's Sony, Samsung, LG, Hisense, and TCL. According to the suit, the TVs that were manufactured by those companies were using something called automated content recognition, or ACRs, in order to provide essentially live surveillance of your behavior while you were using that machine. An ACR can capture screenshots of a user's television every 500 milliseconds. They can also monitor viewing in real time, and they can transmit that information back to the company without the viewer's consent. Not just their consent, they can also do it without their knowledge. So you don't know about it, and so of course you don't consent to it. These companies could then sell that information to data brokers or to ad services in order to send more targeted, relevant advertising to those users. Now, I am not the biggest fan of the Texas Attorney General for reasons that you could probably guess, but I was glad to see someone taking action about this, because it's just another instance of some device that we've put into our homes being used not only to do what we paid for, but to actually spy on us. But in the age of social media, all of this has gotten even more extreme. When Facebook was exploding in popularity, there would be these places on your profile where you could list your favorite things. You could talk about your favorite bands or your hobbies or your favorite books and movies. And then eventually you could join groups or you could like pages, all of which were supposed to be relevant to your interest. All this was purportedly in the name of building social connection. That's kind of the whole pitch of platforms like this, right? Tell us more about you so we can help you find people to interact with. But while we were giving away all this information, we were letting Facebook, which is now Meta since they changed their name, even more personal information. And all of that was being used primarily for the ad economy. And these companies are so dependent on ads that they are willing to do things to you that are frankly egregious. There has been some recent reporting about Facebook where Facebook knew that some of their advertising was being used not only to sell cheap crap to their customers, but actually to actively scam consumers. They knew about it and they chose not to shut it down because they would have lost advertising revenue. If you want to read more about that, I'll put an article down below. What's so weird about the case of social media to me is that it wasn't a case where our privacy was stolen, but we voluntarily gave up all of that information about ourselves. Now I think it's safe to say that corporations like Facebook and Google and TikTok, but not just social media platforms, basically every major corporation, know more about you than maybe your closest friends. After all, most of us would not let our closest friends or our spouses see our browsing history, but Google knows everything you search for. The information isn't only used by one company too. It is packaged and bought and sometimes stolen, we'll talk about that in a second, by other companies that don't have the technological means to gather all this information. So anyone with enough money will be able to use that information for themselves. And this has led to the rise of data brokers who are able to generate hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue selling your personal information. They package it together with the information of huge numbers of people, and then they sell access to it. That's their whole business model. Even companies like Experian and Equifax, which we think of in the United States as primarily those companies which generate our credit scores, well, they can also sell your information to advertisers. When I bought a car here in Texas, I noticed that I started to get a lot of spam mail, not in my inbox, but in my physical mailbox. And most of this spam was trying to sell me what were clearly scam, like extended warranties from my car, not even from the manufacturer, but from some other company. And they always looked really official. They would say final notice on them. And they would try to make themselves almost look like bank or government documents. Now, the only reason they were able to do this is because they were able to access information about my purchase. Perhaps they had gotten this from a data broker, which knew about a large transaction that I had just undertaken. Perhaps they got this from public records, which could show that I had recently registered a car. I don't know exactly how they did it, but clearly lots of these scam companies were able to access this information and use it for something that was clearly not in my best interest. And even if a company has your best interest at heart, which they don't, by the way, we should always just assume that they don't, that doesn't stop your data from being used in ways that you wouldn't like. That's because your data can be stolen. I feel like I get emails every other week about data breaches, whether that's passwords being leaked or private information, because I have to continuously give my information to all sorts of companies that I want to do business with, even hospitals. My wife and I welcomed our daughter into the world late last year. And this means that those hospital groups and also their billing partners have a lot of data about me and about my wife and also about my infant. In 2010, of course, there was the famous Cambridge Analytica scandal. So Cambridge Analytica harvested the data off of Facebook from 87 million accounts. And they used that specifically to do targeted advertising for two Republicans, Ted Cruz and Donald Trump. This was widely called a misuse or abuse of the data. And I do think that's true, but I think it can be a little bit misleading because what I believe is correct is actually a little bit more radical. It's not just that the data was being abused or misused, it's that no one should have ever had it. And I can say that because I believe that we have a right, like a real fundamental human right, to privacy. It turns out, though, that most people in power don't agree. We don't have a single comprehensive piece of privacy legislation in this country. We have instead a patchwork of laws which protect our privacy in some domains. Most of these are related to children. That's good. And to healthcare. Some states like California have passed more robust privacy legislation, but it's very patchwork and it won't apply to other states, obviously. At least in the United States, the norm is that privacy is not treated like a fundamental human right. That means that corporations and the government, sometimes working together, can violate our privacy on essentially a daily basis. So in an article at 404 Media, Joseph Cox reported that Flock was developing a broader range of surveillance tools and that law enforcement was already interested in using them. Flock's cameras were originally pitched as license plate readers. People still often refer to them simply as LPRs. But Flock always said that they could do more than that. They could identify a vehicle imprint that would allow them to simply identify the car, not only using the license plate. This isn't anything like those annoying traffic cameras that maybe send you a ticket if you run a red light. These are AI-powered cameras that are part of a surveillance network that can track your movements across a city or a region. In May of 2025, it was leaked that Flock was developing a tool called Nova. This would combine Flock's camera network with things like people lookup tools, information that they procured from data brokers, and information from data breaches to create a tool that could track people without a warrant or a court order. One of those key phrases there was data breaches. They were going to use hacked data that had been obtained illegally and then erroneously released into the world in order to build a better surveillance network. In audio that was leaked to 404 Media, one employee said that they could now make the cognitive leap from license plate to person. So they aren't just tracking cars, they are tracking people. And they're doing it outside of the ordinary protections of the law. A month after that leak, Flock announced they were creating something called the Flock Business Network. This would be a collaborative network for private security companies to work together, they say collaboratively, to prevent crime. This would allow companies to conduct joint investigations, that's a phrase that Flock used in their press release, while also allowing private companies to retain control over their own data. That is particularly ironic. Flock wants to make sure that the companies that pay them get to hold on to their own data, but part of their business model is using data that we don't get to hold on to. And that, I think, is one of those things that just like really fucking bothers me. Like one of those things that just makes me so angry when I think about this. There are different rules, Flock is saying, for individuals and for the corporations that pay them. Now, there is a lot of public outcry about Flock right now, but as far as I can tell, everything they're doing is legal. Let me just complain about trying to make this video for a second. I had started researching this video months ago, and then I would set it aside while I worked on other projects. And look, I'm slow when I make videos, and that's usually fine. But this was one of the few videos I've ever made that is so in the news that every time I delayed it by a week or two, there was always some news story, particularly about Flock, that came in that I felt like I had to talk about or add. And so I left a lot of things out of this video. Not too long ago, there was this huge leak that actually gave people access to Flock's cameras. They were able to hack into Flock's cameras because there was a leak of their security system. The YouTuber Ben Jordan worked with 404 Media and did some great work about this. I'll just link that below. It shows how extensive and just creepy all of this stuff is, but they're going to say it way better than I could. Flock works with the corporate world, but they also work with the government. The idea that the government might be spying on you really isn't anything new. In 2013, we had the massive Snowden leaks, and it was revealed that the NSA, along with the Five Eyes intelligence network, had engaged in an aggressive campaign of mass surveillance. Burton Gelman was one of the journalists who worked on that story for the Washington Post at the time, and he's described this as intelligence networks giving up all of their historical restrictions after 9/11. After the terrorist attack on September 11th, 2001, they no longer felt constrained by old norms or by old laws, and in the name of preventing terrorism, mass surveillance was expanded. I remember when this came out, it was this really huge deal. Like, everyone was really bothered by it. But there are now teenagers who are alive today who have never lived in a world without this mass surveillance. It's not some new scandal that they can get angry about and then just slowly accept. It's just the world that they were born into. It's also a part of the historical record that there have been corporations that work with government to police and surveil the people for a very long time. I don't play a lot of video games anymore, but I think one of the greatest games ever made is Red Dead Redemption 2. I know that's a really hot take, right, to say that Red Dead Redemption 2 is good. In that game, one of the great villains are the Pinkertons. Well, the Pinkertons weren't just characters in that game. They were actually an organization that existed in the United States, and they served as essentially private investigators and private police, and they were often used to bust unions. Flock's model of working with the corporate world and with the government just follows a similar pattern. And Flock is extending their network too. So Amazon owns Ring doorbells, those, camera doorbells that everyone puts on their front door, and they now actually cooperate with Flock. So all of those doorbells that your neighbors point directly into the street so that they can see you every time they walk, so you can be seen every time you walk by, they can now be integrated into Flock's surveillance network. I know when you say this stuff, it can sound conspiratorial. So that's why I've been just trying to show you things that Flock says directly on their own website so that they're not trying to hide it. And it's not a conspiracy, it's just their business model. Ring had their own press release about this when they announced it under the headline, Ring expands community requests to additional community safety partners. That is a very mild way of describing what they're doing, which is adding millions of cameras to Flock's surveillance network. And all of this does already have an effect. So in December, there was a shooting on Brown's campus. The suspected gunman was Claudio Valente. It's alleged that he killed 2 people at Brown and left 9 wounded. It's then alleged that he went to Boston and murdered a physics professor at MIT. When Valente was found, the chief of police in Providence credited Flock with helping with the investigation. Flock had used some of their AI features, like the ability to detect a car even when the license plate had been changed, in order to find Valente. People who support mass surveillance will always point to things like this. They'll point to the success stories, the place where, a criminal or a murderer was caught using this. But it's just as important to remember the places where this goes wrong. As I was researching this video, I came across another video, and this was footage of a woman being interrogated by the police at her own door. A police officer was accusing her of having driven to another neighborhood and stealing packages off of people's porches. In that video, he tells her that he has all the evidence he needs because his town has cameras everywhere. At one point, he says, "You can't take a breath in this town without us knowing."
We have cameras in that town, and you can't get a breath of fresh air in or out of that place without us knowing, correct?
What's that mean exactly? It means that wherever you go, you have to assume that you're being recorded. Now, this woman, it turned out, was innocent, but she had to prove her innocence. It's already an inverted way of thinking about this, but she had to prove her innocence to show that she was falsely accused. She was able to do this by using data from her car, which showed her travel history, which meant she had not been in the place of the crime. And she showed photos of her outfit from that day, which had timestamps, which showed that she was wearing completely different clothes than the person who had stolen the packages. Louis Rossman made a great video about this way, just like with Ben Jordan's video. I'm going to link it down below so that you can watch that later if you'd like. And he puts it really well there, where he says that the solution to this woman being falsely accused was actually for her to prove that she had been under surveillance the entire time. She had been under surveillance by her car and by her phone and by Google, and that was used as evidence against the erroneous surveillance results from this town's camera network. This is, I think, like the terrible predicament we're in when we talk about privacy, because it's a race to the bottom, and as we reach that bottom, we all just lose our privacy. Now, earlier I said that privacy is a human right. Well, the idea that privacy is a human right is pretty controversial. In 1890, the Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis wrote an article with an attorney named Samuel Warren, which was called The Right to Privacy. This is widely held to be the document that gave birth to the idea that privacy is a right. Warren and Brandeis start that piece by arguing that legal rights have greatly expanded over time. So originally, the law only recognized a few rights. Like when we talked about liberty, all it meant was the right not to be detained. And we only punished force, which actually caused injury. But over time, the sphere of law and our conceptions of rights will broaden and expand based on particular societal needs. And they said that the right to privacy was now becoming a concern for the law, where previously the law could just be silent on the matter because of new technologies. One of them was the camera. If you read the article, Warren and Brandeis talk about something called instantaneous cameras. And they don't mean something like a Polaroid, and they certainly don't mean something like our phones, which are instantaneous cameras. They're actually talking about normal film cameras that we would kind of call vintage today. The sort of camera where all you had to do was point and click, and then you would have the photo stored on film. 2 years before they had released that article, Kodak had released their first cameras to the public. For $25, you could buy a camera from Kodak. It had a fixed lens, and it was preloaded with a film roll. You could take 100 photos, and then you would send the camera to Kodak with $10. They would develop your photos, and they would send the camera back with a new roll of film. They had a marketing slogan for this. They would write, "You press the button, we do the rest." Taking photos was now easier than ever, and that was what was making people nervous. Suddenly, in order to have your photo taken, you didn't have to sit for a portrait, and that meant it was a lot easier for you to have your photo taken without your consent. If you were walking around in public, someone could just snap a photo using something like these Kodaks, and people felt like they were being violated. If you look at the historical record, people who are reacting to this new technology, they talk about it like it's a moral violation to have their photo taken without their consent. But we didn't have an idea of the right to privacy. These concerns were made even more pressing by the fact that your voice might be recorded without your consent. Warren and Brandeis say actually that there is a common protection in law that you get to choose how your ideas are expressed to the public. But microphones would threaten to change all of that. If you could be recorded in a private conversation, then suddenly you did not have the power to determine when your ideas would be expressed in public at all. Someone else could do that for you without your knowledge. Of course, reading Warren and Brandeis' article is almost a little bit quaint because they're worried about these technologies and the loss of our privacy. And what has happened since they wrote this is that those technologies have just accelerated. And for the most part, people have accepted it. We record everything. We live in a world where at almost any place or any time you might be surveilled. There are security cameras or government monitoring your phone and internet activity, your ISP and Google and these other corporations monitoring all of your activity. And much of the time, we're also just being recorded by the people around us who just pick up their phones and press record. Every time there's a tragedy or a public fight or anything like that, you'll see in any video of it, you'll see a circle of people around it, and they're not helping anybody. They just stand back and they start recording because they want to preserve this, maybe post it later. And now, as you go for a walk in your neighborhood, doing absolutely nothing wrong, you could be surveilled by those doorbells and dash cams that could be later on part of a much bigger surveillance network. The solution to this problem would hardly be straightforward. It's a multifaceted problem, and so that means that the solution is probably going to be multifaceted as well. It's probably not a surprise to hear me say that I support privacy legislation. I would like to see much more robust protections for privacy, but I also think it requires a shift in culture and a shift in how we think about ourselves and our rights, but also how we think about each other. In an article earlier this year, the writer Serena Smith put it really well, that we all know too much about each other. In her article, Smith uses the example of this thing called the ring. The ring is a ring that you would wear that would record your biometric data. And it was being marketed to couples. So couples would be able to wear the ring. And while they were wearing it, they could track each other's heart rates and body temperature and thus their emotional shifts. And the ring said that they wanted to make true love trackable. Smith argues, and I think she's absolutely right about this, that true love isn't the sort of thing that can be tracked. That's because love, as well as like friendship or just like living in a society with each other, requires trust. And that's what we lose when we lose our privacy. We lose our ability to trust each other. So in addition to protest and legislation and all of this, I think there needs to be an acceptance of knowing less about each other. But we find that when we know less about each other and we let that mystery remain even between our, most intimate loved ones, that actually allows us to love each other more, and it allows us to trust each other more. That builds a happier culture, and it builds a culture full of human beings that are actually flourishing and living good lives. That, I think, is what the loss of privacy takes away from us. Now, if we're talking about cameras everywhere, one of the things we really should talk about is the prevalence of police body cams. After 2020 or so, we saw a huge surge in the amount of body cams that were out there and the amount of footage that was now available. This was often motivated by the idea that we needed criminal justice reform, but it's had an unintended consequence, which is the proliferation of body cam content. And this is the topic of Lindsay Ellis's latest video. Lindsay does a deep dive into the strange world of body cam content. Since body cam footage is a matter of public record in the United States, YouTube channels can get access to it. They use this to make content like of Karens getting arrested at airports. And this turns all of it into a spectacle. Sometimes these videos are about police violence or some injustice, but often it's about turning someone's worst day into a source of content. And if you want to watch that video, it is available over on Nebula. Nebula is a creator-owned streaming platform that has some of your favorite thoughtful creators. There are way too many to name, but some of my favorites are Religion for Breakfast, Man Carrying Thing, Thomas Flight, and of course, Lindsay Ellis. It's a curated experience that prioritizes thoughtfulness and being good to the people who subscribe. More and more, Nebula is producing exclusives that are only available on the platform. We have original video essays like the work that Lindsay Ellis does, but we also have documentaries like Tom Nicholas's Boomers and even short films like The Dinner Plan. I put my videos on Nebula first too, so if you want to see my next video, it is available on the platform right now. All you have to do is go down to the link below. Right now, if you use my link, you can get 50% off an annual subscription. That makes it $30 a year or $2.50 a month. You can use the QR code that's on the screen, but you can also go to my link. That's go.nebula.tv/Jared Henderson. It's easy to sign up, and then you can start watching my video or the latest from Lindsay Ellis.